I had a question. I had a question. So just going back to a little bit back to Atlantis and how, because people weren't really fascinated by it. It's quite like a recent, in the last sort of 150 years that people are really fascinated with Atlantis. When did people start or stop looking for Atlantis around the kind of Straits of Gibraltar? And when did they start looking elsewhere in the world? Was that around that 70s mark where everybody was doing?
Yes, because what you had really, it was kind of an outgrowth of continental drift and plate tectonics theory.
Right, yeah.
Was actually proposed in the early 20th century, but not accepted until the 1960s and 1970s, and it became part of the geological dogma. And pretty much I have no reason to question the basic premises of plate tectonic theory or continental drift. But that was when a group of geologists, and coming out of the 60s, that whole period of time, that's when New Age thinking really started, going to another level. And, you had...
I remember.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. You were there. I know you were there.
I remember. You were there in 1960. What a decade.
Yeah, it was quite a decade. Yes, it was. But there was just this flurry of thinking that was like completely outside. If you go back between the 50s and the late 60s, it's like two different worlds almost. And so what happened was, I think that there was a lot of, there was this, you remember the song Atlantis by Donovan? Way down below the ocean, where blah, blah. You don't remember that? You could sing.
Beyond the sea. I know that one.
Beyond the sea. Yeah, sorry.
Way down
below the ocean, something like that. It was a very popular song.
Everybody sing the chorus. That old banger.
You don't know that, Brad?
Not at all. Heard of
it? Really? He's just shy. He's shy.
We're doing a cover of it at the next Scablands.
I'm trying to pull up the lyrics here.
Yeah, pull up the lyrics. It's actually, so it was I'm just citing that as an example. It was a very popular song. Donovan, you know Donovan? He was the Scottish folk singer, very popular in the 60s, 70s, kind of considered to be the UK's counterpart to Bob Dylan.
Oh, okay. No, that's embarrassing. I don't know that, but yeah, I know Bob Dylan.
It's like Mellow Yellow.
Mellow Yellow, yes. Now, Laura, how do you know that? You weren't
Season of the Witch.
Season of the Witch.
No, I know that one. Okay.
Yeah.
That was Donovan.
Okay.
I had a Donovan phase.
Did you really?
Oh yeah.
Okay. How about that? So how does somebody like you discover?
I was listening to Die. I went to art school and we do all kinds of weird stuff.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So anyways, he did this song, Atlantis, very popular. And I'm just citing that as an example. I mean, it was the late 60s, early 70s. So many of these things that were kind of outside the mainstream suddenly became popular.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of talk about Atlantis and speculation about Atlantis. And so I think then that the scholars, the serious scholars and geologists and scientists and stuff felt that they were a duty to come out and try to, lay to rest some of this pseudoscience that seemed to be, occupying so much of people's attention. So in 1978, there was a book that came out called Atlantis, Fact or Fiction. And I did actually read that about that time or shortly thereafter. And we could actually, let's see here.
You quote a lot of that book in the videos that I've watched.
Yes.
And you talk about how they jumped the gun a bit, didn't they? They categorically said Atlantis couldn't be physically possible, but
that's right. That's exactly right. So and it was Dorothy B. Vitaliano, who was a distinguished geologist at the time. She was the one who actually coined the term geomythology, and she was very open to a lot of stuff. But when it came to Atlantis, in this book, in her chapter was entitled Atlantis from the Geologic Point of View. 1978, this is a quote from her. Inasmuch as all references to Atlantis stem from Plato and no other source, which is not entirely true, but almost true, in deciding whether it is fact or fiction, or to put it another way, whether it is legend or myth, we are faced with three options. Number one, we can take everything Plato says quite literally. Two, we can take his words seriously, but not literally. or 3, we can take Atlantis as purely and simply his invention. And so what she then does is goes back to the 1982 book authored by Ignatius Donnely, who was a congressman from my home state, who as I understand it, ran for Congress just so that he could get to Washington and have access to the Library of Congress. So he spent all of his time. 1882. Yeah, 1882. Did I say 1982?
Yeah, I was like,
okay.
Whoa. I found a copy of that in a charity shop, but it was like one of the, not on a first edition, but it was like a really old edition of, so I bought that straight away.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear you say that. So you have one of the older, was it a hardback?
It's a old hardback. I think it was like it's like an 1890 something. It's an old book, but it's not one of the first editions. But
you know what? I bet it's worth money though.
Well, that's why I grabbed it.
And especially after people see this podcast, it'll probably double or triple in price.
Exactly. If anyone would like to purchase that book, then they can go to my YouTube channel. No, I'm joking. I am keeping that book for as long as I live.
And so she goes back to Ignatius Donnelly's 1880. Now there was earlier stuff than that. You know, Athanasius Kircher, he wrote about Atlantis and others. And it was quite interesting of value and importance to Arabs and to the Arab traditions who took it literally. But so in 1882, Donnelly publishes this book in which he argues that there really wasn't Atlantis. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, in that book, which was again, I read that about that time, late 70s. In that book, he theorizes that it was a comet impact that caused the destruction of Atlantis. So he was, I think, in some ways, really quite ahead of his time. Dorothy Vitaliano, she goes back and references Donnelly's book. She says, since that book is still being sold in bookstores everywhere and has provided the basis for numerous other works, it is desirable to explain why his literal interpretation of Plato's description is utterly inconsistent with modern scientific knowledge. Donnelly outlined 13 propositions in support of which he then proceeded to marshal all kinds of evidence. But only 2 of these propositions are relevant to a geologically oriented discussion. And here's his 2 propositions. Number 1, there once existed in the Atlantic Ocean, opposite the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea, a large island, which was the remnant of an Atlantic continent and known to the ancient world as Atlantis. Proposition 2, that Atlantis perished in a terrible convulsion of nature in which the whole island sunk into the ocean with nearly all its inhabitants. So then she goes on to say, in light of what is known today about the ocean floors, we can definitely rule out the possibility of a sunken landmass of any substantial size in the Atlantic, or for that matter, in any other ocean basin. Nowhere in the ocean basins is there any sign of a large mass of continental type crust, which could represent a submerged continent. I would have to comment.
Has she been down there? How does she know that for sure? Like, she's being very strongly worded there for a woman who's not been to the bottom.
This is 1978, right? Now, if we jump ahead, this is from the NOAA site, the National Atmospheric and Oceanic Administration, a few years ago. And this is what their site says. And these are guys who have, really studied the ocean and the ocean floors, right? So here's direct quote from their website. Like the rest of the deep ocean floor, we have explored less of the mountains of the mid-ocean ridge system than the surface of Venus or Mars or the dark side of the moon. Use of submersible or remotely operated vehicles to explore the mid-ocean ridge has provided information on less than 0.1% of the mid-ocean ridge. Much of the mid-ocean ridge still remains a mystery. Now, this is 30 years after Vitaliano made her basically sweeping dismissal, right?
She looks stupid now. I'm just going to say it.
I don't want to be too hard on her because she did some cool stuff. She was a cool lady. But when it came to this, she pretty much stuck to the mainstream view. Mm-hmm. I'm surprised, though, that even by 78, there was already in the 10-hour stuff, I quote a lot of that stuff from prior to 1978 that is showing that there were subsided land masses on the bottom of the ocean.
It's all the trips that were in like the 40s, 50s, 60s. That's where they find all this evidence. And I was a little bit like, she never rebuted all of those facts that you put forward. So yeah, it seemed a bit confusing.
Yeah.
Like she didn't answer all of the evidence that you found. Your work is amazing. So when I'm having conversations with people about Atlantis and we're getting down to the argument of whether or not it could be possible or impossible, you put forward such great arguments. But there's one area that I get stuck on when people say the quote about Atlantis being the same size as Asia and Libya. And I don't know how to answer that one. So if you could help me with my, what do you interpret that as being in the text?
Okay, well, a couple of ways. Number one, I'm not saying that Plato's account was literally correct in every detail.
Mm-hmm.
But also, it's important to realize that, we have to ask, well, what framework are we, what is the geographical framework that, Libya was pretty much northern Africa to the west of Egypt. That was Libya, right? Europe, I mean, in Plato's time, how much of that was associated with the full extent of Europe as we imagine it today? But let me pull something up here, because Plato's account makes it clear that it wasn't a single island. In fact, the thing that I'm saying is that we have to look at the whole complex of Macaronesia, which includes the Azores, Madeira, and the Canaries, right? Mm-hmm. Now, if I go to, let's see, if I go to Polynesia, let me just see this. We'll try this first once. Polynesia, which, is the Pacific Island group, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm pulling up here Polynesia. Polynesia is a subregion of Oceania made up of more than 1,000 islands scattered over the central and southern Pacific Ocean. Let's see if it actually gives us the geographical area. Let's see here. Polynesia covers 270,000 square kilometers. So now if we are talking about, what's the area of Polynesia? Well, is it the area of the individual islands, or is it really the area of the whole complex? So when we say 270,000 square kilometers, we're talking about the whole complex of Polynesia, because it encompasses the oceanic areas in amongst the islands. To me, if there's any explanation besides just hyperbole that you would expect to find in an account like that, we have to look at the whole area of Macaronesia and not just the area of one single island. Now, right behind Brad there,
Perfect, thank you.
There we go. Okay, so this is the Azores Plateau right here.
Yep.
And the data suggests that, and particularly again, the point that I've stressed is it's at that it straddles a triple plate junction, which is a place where one would expect that there could be massive vertical movements due to the glacial unloading. And in the 6 hours that I'm going to be doing live this Thursday and then again on the February 20th, I'm going to get into all of that. So I won't get into it in that depth.
We'll save the goods for Thursday. But okay, that makes a lot of sense, because I say that as well. Like most people don't know that Atlantis was part of a kingdom of like 10 kingdoms. That it says that had continents, peninsulas. Like people just think it's this one like magical little island.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that he was talking about potentially all the kingdoms were bigger than like Libya, and of course Libya was just North Africa, and Asia could have been just Turkey, like Asia Minor.
Yeah. We don't really know, but I mean, that to me is not a deal killer, because there's a potential explanation for that. And, even if that explanation is not correct, which I tend to think that, if you look at, again, Plato's account, you'll see that he does definitely refer to there being multiple islands.
Well, even if it went down into the Caribbean and Cuba, then that would expand it really greatly. You could put some really big numbers on that and compare it to a landmass.
Yeah, and Plato does make the point. Yeah, Now in this, and here's the quote from Plato, now in this island of Atlantis, there was a great and wonderful empire which had rule over the whole island and others, and over parts of the continent. And furthermore, the men of Atlantis had subjected the parts of Libya within the column of Heracles as far as Egypt, and of Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. So right there, that's like one of the references that talks about the empire. So if you look at it as from that perspective, yes, within the whole complex of the multiple islands that made up the core of the Atlantean Empire, and then you look at the outlying, whatever you want to call it, the colonies. You come up with a tremendously vast area. Now, if you look at this, the Azores Plateau, it's just close to the size of Iceland. I'm not sure what the area of Iceland is. I've looked it up.
It's 330 kilometers, I think. Is it 550? I might have shot myself in the foot there. I'm gonna say
across.
Or that might
width,
yeah.
Are you saying? Not square kilometers, but width.
It was something super similar to. It was like of a similar size to what Plato was saying Atlantis was.
Yeah, I can tell you here in a second. Here, Iceland.
Let's see. I might lose my gold star.
No, you're safe for the moment. Okay. Just under 40,000 square miles.
Oh, okay. Maybe Iceland's a lot smaller then.
Just under 40,000 square miles. But if you do 40,000, and I take the square root of that, it's 200 miles.
200 miles.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're in the ballpark.
300. Okay.
Well,
yeah, kilometers. Yeah, you're close.
Well, kilometers, yes, 300. So no, you don't. I don't have to take away your gold star yet.
Oh, thank God! Great. Okay. Great.
So.
You said yes.
No, in fact, actually, that's about right. 300 kilometers, 200 miles. Yeah. So
bang on. Shouldn't have doubted myself.
Opposed to Jahannah. What it boils down to in part two of the presentation, I'm going to get into more of like the first part's going to be, we're going to start analyzing, Plato's account, and we're going to be looking at the evidence for these geomorphic changes and geological changes. The two terms, which, at some point you will be quizzed, Jahannah, but isostasy. Say it a couple of times.
Isostasy.
That's the vertical movement of the Earth's crust.
Okay, the isostasy.
Now, well, here's one more that goes right along with isostasy is eustasy. Well, now we're talking about eustatic. There's isostatic adjustment of the landmass, and then there's eustatic changes in the oceans. Eustatic has to do with the ocean water going down as glaciers grow on land. And as glaciers on land melt away, ocean level comes up. That's the eustatic rise and fall of sea level, which corresponds to the growth and shrinkage of the great ice sheets.
Got it. Yes, I remember that from the references that you were putting in your work about how the plates go up and down when there's a melt water goes in, and it made a lot of sense. And now I know the word. Okay.
Yeah. In fact, so I want to show you, I'm going to actually do a share screen here.
Oh.
And this is along Hudson Bay. Now, you know what this is? These are shorelines, right? So now these are shorelines from the isostatic rising of the land around Hudson Bay. Look at this. So you can see here's the bay. And as you go up, you can actually see that as you go up, and this is like 1,000 feet above sea level, the highest shorelines, and it's not done yet. But what you see is that as you get closer to sea level, the distance between the successive shorelines is getting wider because the isostatic rise is slowing down from when it was first deglaciated. Okay. But you can see, again, these are shorelines here, and this is from the rise of the land. This is your isostatic rise. And so all of this area here was buried under like 1.5 miles of ice. So that 1.5 miles of ice is so heavy, it just compresses the ground, maybe up to as much as 2,000 feet. Now, when the ice is removed, the land begins to rebound back. And now the analogy I use is like, are you sitting right now on a chair with a cushion on it? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So isostatic depression of the seat of the chair while you're sitting on it. And if you stand up, will the depression formed by your derriere?
You get butt marks in the chair.
Yeah. That's isostatic depression.
Great.
So, and then when you stand up, the cushion rises back out, and that is isostatic rise, isostatic compensation. Compensation is just moving, according to the weight. And it really is surprising. It doesn't, in terms of the size of the planet, it doesn't really take that much weight itself. But so now all of that weight, most of the Laurentide ice sheet, which is the great eastern ice sheet that was as big as the one now covering the South Pole, almost all of that water, when it melted, went back into the North Atlantic. So you have this rapid, geologically speaking, rapid rise of sea level. Theoretically, there has to be a response. As here is rising, this is going to go down. And it's like this, you see. So when
it's like being on a waterbed with someone.
Yes.
Someone
exactly.
Gets in and you're like, whoa. Yeah. Okay. I can visualize it now.
Yes. Okay. So I guess I thought do they still have water beds?
I don't think so, but I remember being on one as a kid and thinking it was the best thing ever.
All right. Yeah.
But that makes sense. When someone gets in a waterbed, it goes up and down. And someone gets out, you'll
exactly.
You'll rise up.
And so if you get in one side of the waterbed and the weight goes down, it pushes the water laterally, which causes the other side to go up. When you get out, so that's a perfect example, Jahannah. I'm going to have to give you another star.
Yes.
Yeah, you're racking them up.
Come on, Brad, you got to get
racking them up.
I do have a question about this then. So say we were running with the theory that Atlantis was one of the islands around the Azores Plateau, and the sea level was 400 foot lower back then.
Lower. Yeah.
And then in theory, when the melt pulse water came in and everything rose for 400 foot, but also there would be that movement on top of that 400, you would also be getting that weird platonic movement.
Right. So the sea level is the eustatic rise of sea level is accompanied with the isostatic depression of the ocean floor.
Mm-hmm.
So together, those two, sea level's 400 feet, which means that it's going to roughly double the size of those islands. But if you have subsidence of up to, in fact, some of the empirical data suggests subsidence in some of the areas up to 2,500 feet. So you're basically looking at up to 3,000 feet change in difference between when you add in the eustatic rise of sea level and the isostatic depression of the ocean floor, perhaps a differential of up to close to 3,000 feet.
And so if you do that, of it 3,000 feet under
the bottom, 2,500 feet.
So it's within the parameter of
So that's cool. And here's the thing: you don't have to go to crystal ray guns and flying spaceships or any of that kind of stuff when you're talking about Atlantis. If we go back to what Plato's talking about, he's basically talking about a highly sophisticated maritime culture, perhaps something along the lines of the Minoans or the Phoenicians, but raised by an order of magnitude. Now, where he does get into, something that sounds like an extraordinarily organized civilization anyway, is when he starts describing the infrastructure that they created, right? Which would have truly been extraordinary. And I am going to get into that in the live streams that we do. But, really, when we look at the ancient world, what do we see over and over again? Mind-blowing engineering and building capabilities.
Yeah.
Whether it's Egypt, whether it's South America, the ability to move these massive 50, 100, 200-ton stones all over the world, all over the ancient world. I mean, as a builder, that's one of the things that has really been driven home to me, is because, even just if you got to put a beam in place that weighs 1 ton, unless you have large mechanical cranes and stuff, it's a challenging task. When you think about moving stones and transporting, and you guys went to Aswan, right? Where the big unfinished obelisk is.
Yeah. I stood on it and got told off. Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember.
Right. Okay. So you know what I'm talking about, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that there may have been extraordinary capabilities in the prehistoric ancient world, to me, is not such a huge stretch as some people might imagine it to be. Because we do see at the dawn of civilization all over the world, people doing things that completely out of the range and scale of what we'd ordinarily think that hunter-gatherers, migrant societies, subsistence farmers, why would they be interested in moving 100-ton stone? There's no real practical reason for that. If you're a subsistence farmer.
At Aswan, when I went to see it, it's not just the fact that it's like over 1,000-ton stone. I was stood and I did a little like look around, and it was the terrain that they would have had to have moved it over as well. That was equally as impressive, because it was like, it's not flat. There was uphill, there was inclines, right. And I was like, even if you did manage to lift that out with some kind of crane, how are you transporting it over and down this like rocky, hazardous, like, you had to watch your foot just walking as a human, let alone carrying anything. I was like, it was blowing my mind how they would even move something across rocky terrain. And I only noticed that from being on the ground, because I was looking around. But yeah,
it's a mystery. And I think there's some ideas out there that may be in the right direction. And I almost have to conclude it was not brute force, because it'd be one thing to say, okay, there was one really, idiosyncratic culture that for whatever reason felt it necessary to move very large stones around. But when you find it all over the world, it just doesn't seem to add up. I mean, every year, new stuff is coming to light that I think is forcing us to reevaluate that lost, what I refer to as the deep history of the human species. It goes back probably a couple of 100,000 years, if not longer, that our modern ancestors have been on this planet. I mean, we're finding skeletal remains that are 150, 180,000 years old that we can't really even differentiate between, something that old and a modern skeleton. So my thought is, when you start thinking about it, okay, well, for all of those generations, hundreds of generations, nobody came up with, there was no accumulated learning that was passed on and passed down. And generation after generation, they were just stuck in this stagnant level where nobody went beyond hunting and gathering. And
then all of a sudden, everywhere in the world kind of just had a realization of oh, wow, we should build stuff.
This is getting kind of boring here,
Yeah.
Let's do something. Hey, this is getting boring, going after this small game and gathering berries and roots. Let's go quarry some 100-ton stones.